The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, delivered by a postal worker who seemed unusually eager to complete his route and move on. The envelope bore my grandmother's careful script, but the handwriting trembled in places where her usual precision had faltered. Inside, folded between the deed to her Victorian house and a small brass key, lay a single sheet of paper with words that would haunt my understanding of family legacy forever. The portrait in the main hallway, she had written. Burn it. Do not ask questions. Do not research its history. Simply burn it and forget it ever existed. My grandmother, Eleanor Whitmore, had been many things during her 87 years. A school teacher, a community volunteer, a woman of unwavering routine and practical sensibility. She was not given to flights of fancy or superstitious declarations. Yet here, in what would prove to be her final correspondence, she had abandoned all pretense of rationality for a warning that felt more like a desperate plea. I had inherited the house on Elm Street without expectation or desire. Our relationship had been cordial but distant, marked by obligatory holiday visits and brief telephone conversations that rarely strayed beyond discussions of weather and health. She had outlived 2 husbands, buried her only son, my father, and watched her remaining family scatter across the continent like seeds on hostile ground. The house, she had often said, was all that remained of a family that had once held considerable influence in our small New England town. The structure itself commanded attention even from a distance. Built in 1847, it rose 3 stories above a foundation of Connecticut fieldstone, its Gothic Revival architecture lending an air of somber grandeur to the tree-lined street. Gabled windows peered out from beneath heavy eaves, and a wraparound porch supported by carved columns created shadows that seemed to shift and deepen regardless of the sun's position. The house had been painted white once, but decades of weather had faded the exterior to the color of old bone, and the shutters hung at angles that suggested either settling or neglect. I arrived on a Thursday afternoon in late October, when the maples had turned the color of dried blood and the air carried the scent of decay that accompanies the dying of the year. The key turned easily in the lock, as if the house had been expecting my arrival. The front door opened onto a hallway that stretched toward the back of the house, illuminated by a series of windows that filtered the autumn light into something pale and insufficient. And there, positioned where 3 hallways converged, hung the portrait. The painting depicted a man in his middle years, perhaps 40 or 45, dressed in the formal attire of the mid-19th century. His dark hair was combed back from a high forehead, and his eyes, a peculiar shade of gray-green, seemed to follow movement with an intensity that suggested awareness rather than mere artistic skill. The frame was ornate, carved from what appeared to be walnut and gilded with gold leaf that had dimmed to the color of tarnished brass. A small brass nameplate at the bottom bore a single word: Blackwood. The artist had captured something unsettling in the subject's expression. Not malevolence exactly, but a quality of watchfulness that suggested hidden knowledge and withheld judgment. His lips curved in what might have been a smile or might have been something else entirely. The painting dominated the hallway not through size alone, though it was substantial, but through its positioning and the way it seemed to draw attention regardless of one's intended direction of travel. I found my grandmother's note pinned directly to the frame's lower corner, the paper yellowed and brittle as if aged far beyond its actual years. The handwriting that had once graced countless thank-you notes and birthday cards now appeared urgent, almost frantic. "Burn this," she had written again. The words pressed so deeply into the paper that they had nearly torn through to the other side. My rational mind dismissed the warning as the product of an aging woman's declining faculties. My grandmother had spent her final years increasingly isolated, speaking little of her past and showing signs of what I had attributed to the natural paranoia that sometimes accompanies advanced age. She had begun locking doors that had never required locks, checking and rechecking window latches, and expressing concerns about visitors who had never actually called. The portrait, I reasoned, had simply become a focal point for anxieties that had no other outlet. Yet something in the house's atmosphere suggested that rationality might prove insufficient to explain what I had inherited. The air itself felt heavy, weighted with decades of accumulated silence and secrets. Each room I entered seemed to exhale the breath of previous occupants, carrying scents of old wood, faded fabric, and something else, something that reminded me of the way stone smells after rain, cold and mineral and ancient. That first evening, as I sat in my grandmother's parlor surrounded by the accumulated possessions of a long life, I began to understand that I had inherited more than a house and its contents. The portrait's presence pressed against my consciousness like a persistent headache, demanding attention even when I deliberately turned away from it. Every trip to the kitchen required passage beneath that watchful gaze. Every journey upstairs brought me within reach of those painted hands, folded in what appeared to be patient expectation. The practical task of cataloging my inheritance would begin the following morning. But as darkness settled over Elm Street and the house began its nightly symphony of settling wood and adjusting foundations, I found myself returning again and again to my grandmother's warning. The portrait watched these nocturnal wanderings with what seemed like approval, as if my restlessness confirmed some long-held expectation about human nature and family obligation. I would not burn the portrait, not yet. Not until I understood why a rational woman would make such an irrational request, and what secrets my family's history might contain that required destruction rather than preservation. The morning light revealed the true scope of what Eleanor Whitmore had left behind. Room after room contained the careful accumulations of nearly 9 decades. Photograph albums arranged by decade, correspondence filed by year and correspondent, household items maintained with the devotion of a museum curator. She had been, I realized, the keeper of family memory, the designated guardian of a history that stretched back well beyond her own lifetime. The photographs proved most revealing. Album after album documented weddings, christenings, birthday celebrations, and holiday gatherings spanning 4 generations of Whitmores and their associated families. What struck me immediately was the consistency of location, the same rooms, the same arrangements of furniture, the same architectural details appearing across decades of family documentation. And in photograph after photograph, visible in the background of countless family moments, hung the portrait of the man named Blackwood. He watched over Christmas mornings in the 1920s, presided over wedding receptions in the 1940s, observed birthday parties throughout the 1960s and beyond. In some photographs, family members appeared to be deliberately positioned to avoid the portrait's direct line of sight, clustering at angles that kept them outside what might be considered his field of vision. In others, children were captured mid-glance toward the painting, their expressions curious or apprehensive, as if responding to something beyond the photographer's awareness. The house itself began to reveal its character as I moved through room after room in the growing daylight. Each space carried the weight of careful preservation, furniture covered with sheets, curtains drawn against the sun's fading effects, personal belongings arranged with the precision of someone who expected eventual scrutiny. My grandmother had maintained the house not as a living space but as a kind of monument, a shrine to family continuity that had consumed increasingly large portions of her later years. By afternoon, I had begun to notice the sounds. Old houses settle, of course, their wooden frames adjusting to temperature changes and the gradual effects of gravity and time. But the sounds in my grandmother's house seemed somehow purposeful, as if the building itself were responding to my presence. Footsteps echoed in empty hallways above my head. Doors that I had carefully closed stood ajar when I returned to rooms I had already explored. Most unsettling, the floorboards in the main hallway creaked with what sounded like regular measured pacing, as if someone were walking back and forth before the portrait in a pattern too consistent to be attributed to random settling. The portrait's positioning at the convergence of 3 hallways meant that movement through the house's main floor required frequent passage within its aparo, not field of vision. Each crossing brought a fresh awareness of those painted eyes, which seemed to track movement with an attention that extended well beyond artistic technique. The painter, whose signature remained invisible despite careful examination, had achieved something that transcended mere representation. The eyes possessed depth, intelligence, and what could only be described as malevolent patience. That evening, I attempted to research the painting's origins using the limited resources available in my grandmother's study. Her personal library contained numerous volumes on local history, genealogy, and the development of our region during the 19th century. References to the Whitmore family appeared sporadically throughout these sources, usually in connection with land purchases, civic appointments, or business partnerships that had established their prominence in the community's early development. The name Blackwood, however, proved more elusive. Mentions were fragmentary and often incomplete, as if entire passages had been deliberately obscured or removed. I found references to the Blackwood arrangement, the unfortunate resolution of the Blackwood matter, and the settlement of obligations arising from the Blackwood estate, but no clear explanation of who Blackwood had been or why his portrait should occupy such a prominent position in my family's home. The most substantial reference appeared in a local history published in 1923, which described Blackwood as a merchant of considerable influence whose business arrangements with prominent local families were abruptly terminated following his unexpected death in 1848. The passage continued, "The circumstances surrounding Mr. Blackwood's demise were the subject of considerable speculation, though no official inquiry was ever completed. His estate, including various personal effects and business obligations, was distributed among several local families according to terms that remained sealed by court order. This discovery raised more questions than it answered. What business arrangements had connected Blackwood to the Whitmore family? Why had an official inquiry into his death remained incomplete? And what could explain the prominent display of his portrait in a family home nearly 2 centuries after his death?" As night fell and the house settled into its after-dark configuration, the sounds increased in frequency and specificity. The pacing in the main hallway became more pronounced, accompanied by what sounded like whispered conversations conducted just beyond the range of comprehension. Temperatures dropped noticeably in certain rooms, particularly those with direct sight lines to the portrait, and several times I detected movement in my peripheral vision that vanished when I turned to investigate. The practical explanation for these phenomena lay, I reasoned, in the psychological effects of suggestion and expectation. My grandmother's warning had predisposed me to perceive ordinary house sounds as supernatural manifestations. The portrait's compelling presence naturally drew attention, creating the illusion of active observation. Old houses were notorious for temperature variations and acoustic anomalies that could easily be misinterpreted by someone already primed for supernatural experiences. Yet rational explanation felt insufficient to address the growing certainty that the house contained an active presence, something that responded to investigation and movement with what seemed like purposeful intelligence. The portrait served as a focal point for this presence, but the influence extended throughout the structure, as if Blackwood's painted likeness were merely the visible manifestation of something that had claimed dominion over the entire space. I spent that second night in my grandmother's bedroom, hoping that distance from the main hallway would provide some relief from the sensation of constant observation. But even there, separated by walls and a full floor from the portrait's location, I remained acutely aware of its presence. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of walking through endless corridors, while footsteps echoed behind me, always just out of sight, but keeping perfect pace with my own movements. The portrait's vigil continued through the night, maintaining its patient surveillance over a house that had apparently served as its domain for well over a century. The discovery occurred by accident, as the most significant revelations often do. While examining the floorboards in my grandmother's study for signs of water damage, I noticed that several planks near the built-in bookcase gave slightly under pressure. Further investigation revealed that 3 boards had been cut and refinished to create a hidden compartment, invisible unless one knew precisely where to apply pressure and in what sequence. The compartment contained a single item, a leather-bound ledger approximately 10 inches wide and 14 inches tall, its cover worn smooth by decades of handling. The leather had aged to the color of dried blood, and the brass clasps that secured its contents had developed the green patina characteristic of great age. Inside, written in a careful copperplate hand that matched samples I had found among family correspondence, were entries that documented something far more disturbing than any conventional business transaction. The ledger belonged to Cornelius Blackwood, the man whose portrait dominated my grandmother's hallway. The entries began in March 1847 and continued through December of the same year, each notation meticulously dated and recorded with the precision of an accountant documenting financial transactions. But these were not records of commerce in any traditional sense. March 15, 1847 read the first entry. The Morrison family finds itself in circumstances requiring assistance. 3 children, ages 7, 9, and 11. The eldest shows promise for household service. Arrangements made for placement with the Hartwell establishment in Providence. Compensation, $45, plus assumption of outstanding debt to the grain merchant. Term satisfactory to all parties. Entry after entry followed the same pattern. Families in desperate circumstances, widowed mothers, unemployed laborers, recent immigrants struggling with language and poverty, approached Blackwood for what appeared to be assistance with the placement of their children. The children were described in terms that reduced them to commodities: their ages, apparent health, suitability for various forms of labor, and capacity for what Blackwood termed training and acclimation. The monetary amounts varied considerably. Some families received substantial sums that would have represented months or even years of ordinary wages. Others received only enough to settle immediate debts or purchase passage to other regions. In several cases, no money changed hands at all, with Blackwood services apparently provided in exchange for future considerations or the settlement of existing obligations. Most disturbing were the entries that documented the children's destinations. While some were placed with families in distant cities, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, others were delivered to what Blackwood referred to as private establishments, or specialized institutions, whose purposes remained unclear. These facilities were identified only by location and the name of their proprietor, with no indication of their actual function or the nature of the services they provided. April 22, 1847. The Whitmore family requires resolution of certain legal difficulties arising from property disputes, and outstanding obligations. 2 children from the Kelly household, ages 8 and 10, placed with Dr. Pemberton's establishment near Hartford. Children demonstrated satisfactory compliance during initial assessment. Mr. Whitmore's legal concerns addressed through standard arrangement. No monetary compensation required. My family name appeared in entry after entry, sometimes as beneficiaries of Blackwood services, occasionally as intermediaries who facilitated connections between desperate families and placement opportunities. My great-great-grandfather, Thomas Whitmore, seemed to serve as Blackwood's legal counsel, helping to draft contracts and agreements that legitimized what appeared to be a systematic trade in human beings. The ledger entries grew increasingly cryptic as the year progressed. References to special arrangements, private ceremonies, and covenant obligations suggested activities that extended well beyond simple child placement. Some entries were accompanied by small drawings or symbols that resembled ritual markings rather than business notations. The handwriting itself changed subtly, becoming more hurried and erratic, as if Blackwood were documenting events under increasing pressure or deteriorating circumstances. October 13, 1847. The boundary grows thin. The children's voices carry farther than anticipated. Dr. Pemberton reports difficulty maintaining proper containment. Additional precautions required for the November arrangement. The Whitmore family expresses concern regarding community scrutiny. Reassurances provided regarding long-term discretion. As I read these entries by the fading light of an October afternoon, the house seemed to respond to my discoveries with increasing agitation. The temperature in the study dropped noticeably, and the familiar sounds of settling wood gave way to something that resembled whispered conversation conducted in the walls themselves. The portrait, visible through the study doorway, appeared to exert a stronger pull on my peripheral vision, demanding acknowledgement of its presence with an insistence that bordered on physical compulsion. The final entries in the ledger painted a picture of an operation under stress. Community suspicion had apparently begun to focus on Blackwood's activities, and several families who had previously utilized his services were threatening to expose the true nature of their arrangements. References to maintaining silence and ensuring cooperation suggested that coercion had replaced financial incentive as the primary means of controlling potential witnesses. December 18, 1847. The Thompson child continues to cause difficulties despite corrective measures. Dr. Pemberton recommends permanent resolution before community concerns escalate further. The Whitmore family agrees to maintain existing arrangements in exchange for continued protection from inquiry. The covenant binds all parties to mutual silence. The ledger's final entry was dated December 23, 1847, less than 1 month before the date that local historical sources gave for Blackwood's death. The handwriting was barely legible, written with what appeared to be tremendous haste or under conditions that prevented careful penmanship. The arrangement is complete. The binding holds. The portrait will serve as testament and guardian. Let no future generation forget the terms of our covenant, or the price of breaking faith with those who watch from beyond the boundary of death. As darkness settled over the house, I remained in the study, surrounded by evidence of crimes that had occurred nearly 2 centuries earlier, but whose influence seemed to permeate every board and beam of my inherited property. The portrait's presence pressed against my consciousness with renewed intensity, as if my discovery of the ledger had somehow strengthened the connection between Blackwood's painted likeness and whatever force had maintained its vigilance over the decades. The children whose lives had been documented in those careful entries had vanished into an underworld of exploitation and abuse that my own family had helped to create and maintain. Their voices, if they still existed anywhere, had been systematically silenced by a conspiracy that bound together some of the community's most respected citizens in a web of mutual complicity and shared guilt. The portrait watched my reading of these revelations with what seemed like satisfaction, as if the exposure of historical truth served its purposes rather than threatening its continued dominance over the house on Elm Street. The local historical society occupied a converted bank building on Main Street, its vault now serving as climate-controlled storage for the accumulated records of 2 centuries of community life. The librarian, a woman in her 60s with the careful demeanor of someone who had spent decades guarding institutional memory, initially welcomed my research into 19th-century family genealogy with professional enthusiasm. That enthusiasm dimmed noticeably when I began requesting specific records related to missing children and unexplained deaths during the 1840s. Those records, she explained, are part of a restricted collection. Access requires approval from the Historical Society Board, and we generally don't approve requests unless the researcher has demonstrated legitimate academic credentials and a clear scholarly purpose. When I mentioned my interest in Cornelius Blackwood and his business arrangements with local families, her expression shifted from professional courtesy to something approaching alarm. Mr. Blackwood's affairs, she said carefully, are not a subject that the Historical Society encourages public research. The records from that period are fragmentary and often misleading. We found that amateur investigators tend to draw unwarranted conclusions from incomplete documentation. Her reaction suggested that I was not the first person to inquire about Blackwood's activities, and that previous investigations had resulted in consequences the Historical Society preferred to avoid. After an hour of polite evasion and increasingly creative excuses for why various record collections were unavailable, inaccessible, or temporarily misfiled, I left with the distinct impression that information about Blackwood's era was being deliberately suppressed rather than accidentally lost. The town's newspaper archives, housed in the basement of the public library, proved more accessible but equally frustrating. Issues from 1847 and 1848 contained numerous references to missing children, but the coverage followed a pattern that suggested editorial guidance rather than objective reporting. Initial articles would describe a child's disappearance in detail, including interviews with family members and community concerns about safety. Follow-up articles, appearing weeks or months later, would report that the child had been located safely or had rejoined family members in a distant city without providing specifics about where they had been found or how they had been recovered. In several cases, the families themselves seemed to have vanished along with the missing children. The Kelly family, mentioned in Blackwood's ledger as having provided 2 children for placement with Dr. Pemberton's establishment, disappeared from all public records after April 1847. Their house was sold to cover debts, but no record existed of where the family had relocated or what had become of their remaining members. The pattern extended beyond individual families to include community leaders who had initially expressed concern about the disappearances. Ministers who had preached sermons about the protection of vulnerable children were suddenly reassigned to parishes in other states. Town officials who had called for investigations received unexpected appointments to positions that required relocation. Witnesses who had provided information to early newspaper reports either recanted their statements or claimed to have been misunderstood by the reporters. Most significantly, the newspaper's coverage of Blackwood's own death followed the same pattern of initial detail followed by deliberate vagueness. The first report, published 3 days after his body was discovered, described the scene in terms that suggested violence. Mr. Blackwood was found in his study, apparently the victim of an attack that left the room in considerable disarray. Local authorities have begun an investigation into the circumstances of his death and are seeking information from anyone who may have visited his residence during the preceding week. Subsequent reports provided increasingly less information about the investigation's progress. Within 2 weeks, the newspaper was describing Blackwood's death as the result of a sudden illness that overcame him while working alone in his study. By the end of January 1848, all references to an official investigation had disappeared, and Blackwood's death was being attributed to natural causes related to a chronic condition that had troubled him for some time. The transition from violent death to natural causes suggested intervention by parties with sufficient influence to alter both official findings and newspaper coverage. The timing of this intervention coincided with several significant property transfers and business arrangements that benefited many of the same families mentioned in Blackwood's ledger, including the Whitmores. My great-great-grandfather Thomas had acquired substantial land holdings in February 1848, less than 1 month after Blackwood's death was officially attributed to natural causes. The purchase price, according to deed records, was well below market value, and the transaction was facilitated by a bank that had previously refused the Whitmore family credit due to outstanding debts and questionable collateral. As my research progressed, the portrait's behavior at home intensified dramatically. Objects in the house began moving overnight, books reshelved in different locations, furniture shifted to new positions, curtains drawn or opened according to no pattern I could discern. The temperature variations became more extreme, with some rooms dropping to near freezing levels, while others maintained tropical warmth that had no relation to the heating system's operation. Most disturbing were the voices. They began as whispers that might have been attributed to wind or settling wood, but gradually became more distinct and purposeful. Children's voices, speaking in accents and dialects that predated living memory, called out names and fragments of conversation that seemed to echo from the house's walls themselves. The voices were clearest near the portrait, where they sometimes formed recognizable words. Help us. Remember us. Don't let them forget. The portrait itself underwent subtle but undeniable changes that photographic evidence confirmed were not tricks of light or imagination. Blackwood's expressed. Sion shifted between sessions of photography, sometimes appearing satisfied or amused, other times displaying what could only be described as malevolent anticipation. His painted hands, folded in his lap, occasionally appeared to have moved to different positions, and the papers visible on the desk beside him seemed to rearrange themselves according to some purpose known only to the subject of the painting. Local residents, when approached for information about the house's history or Blackwood's legacy, displayed a consistent pattern of evasion and discomfort. Elderly neighbors who had lived on Elm Street for decades claimed to know nothing about the house's previous occupants or any unusual events associated with the property. Shop owners who had grown up in the community insisted that they had never heard the name Blackwood and suggested that I might be confusing local history with stories from other towns. The coordinated nature of this ignorance suggested something more systematic than normal forgetfulness or the natural fading of historical memory. These residents were actively avoiding discussion of topics that should have been part of the community's shared knowledge, and their discomfort when pressed for information indicated that the avoidance was deliberate rather than accidental. My attempts to locate Dr. Pemberton's establishment near Hartford met with similar frustration. No records existed of any medical or educational facility operated by anyone named Pemberton during the relevant period. Properties that might have served such purposes had changed hands multiple times, and current owners claimed ignorance of their building's previous functions or inhabitants. The systematic erasure of evidence suggested a conspiracy that extended far beyond the original participants in Blackwood's operation. Succeeding generations had apparently worked to maintain the silence that protected their ancestors' reputations, even as the children who had suffered and died in those establishments remained unacknowledged and unremembered. As winter deepened and my research expanded, the supernatural activity in the house reached levels that could no longer be explained by suggestion or psychological predisposition. The portrait had become a focal point for forces that demanded acknowledgement and response. The children's voices grew stronger, more insistent, carrying messages that transcended the normal boundaries between past and present. The truth about Blackwood's activities and my family's complicity was emerging despite decades of careful suppression, but the cost of that revelation was becoming clear. Knowledge brought responsibility, and responsibility carried consequences that might extend well beyond my own safety or peace of mind. The basement of my grandmother's house had been sealed behind a locked door that I had initially attributed to structural concerns or storage of hazardous materials. The key that opened this barrier was not among those my grandmother had left me, but I found it eventually, hidden inside a hollowed-out book on her nightstand, a Bible whose pages had been carefully carved away to create a secret compartment. The basement stairs descended into darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than merely lacking illumination. My flashlight beam penetrated only a few feet before being swallowed by shadows that felt almost tangible. The air carried scents of damp stone and something else, something organic that suggested decay or long-dormant biological processes. At the bottom of the stairs, I discovered that the basement extended far beyond the house's apparent foundation. Additional rooms had been carved from the bedrock itself, their walls lined with stones that had been fitted together with the precision of medieval masons. The construction predated the house above, suggesting that whatever purpose these chambers served had influenced the location and design of the structure built over them. The first chamber contained what appeared to be a workshop, with tables and equipment that might once have served medical or scientific purposes. Shelves lined the walls, holding glass containers whose contents had long since decomposed into unidentifiable residues. Several tables bore restraints that had been built into their surfaces, designed to immobilize subjects of varying sizes, including dimensions that could only have accommodated children. But it was the second chamber that revealed the true nature of Blackwood's activities and their connection to forces that transcended ordinary criminal enterprise. The room had been arranged as a kind of temple or ceremonial space, with symbols carved into the stone walls and floors that drew upon traditions far older than Christian civilization. Candle holders were built into the walls at regular intervals, creating patterns that suggested ritualistic purposes rather than mere illumination. At the center of this chamber stood an altar carved from a single block of dark stone, its surface stained with substances that had penetrated deep into the rock itself. Arranged around this altar were personal belongings that could only have come from children: shoes, toys, items of clothing that had been preserved with the same care that a museum might lavish on precious artifacts. Each item bore a small tag with a name and date, creating a catalog of victims that spanned several years of systematic abuse and murder. The walls around the altar contained carved recesses, each holding what appeared to be a small portrait or death mask. These faces, rendered with disturbing skill, depicted children in various stages of what could only be described as transformation, their expressions shifting from fear to resignation to something that transcended human emotion entirely. The artistic technique was identical to that used in Blackwood's portrait upstairs, suggesting that the same hand had created both the main painting and these smaller memorial pieces. Among the ritual artifacts scattered throughout the chamber, I found books and manuscripts that explained the theoretical framework underlying Blackwood's activities. The texts, written in multiple languages and drawing upon occult traditions from across centuries and cultures, described methods for binding human consciousness to physical objects, creating permanent connections between the living world and whatever realm existence took after death. The most complete manuscript, written in Blackwood's own handwriting, outlined a systematic approach to what he termed consensual transcendence. Children, he argued, possessed a natural openness to spiritual influences that made them ideal subjects for ritualistic transformation. Their suffering, properly channeled and contained, could serve as a bridge between physical and spiritual realms, allowing consciousness to persist beyond bodily death. The portrait upstairs, I realized, was not merely a painting, but the focal point of an elaborate binding ritual. The pigments used in its creation had been mixed with substances derived from Blackwood's victims, creating a physical anchor for his consciousness that would persist long after his body had perished. The children's deaths had provided the spiritual energy necessary to power this transcendence, while their continued captivity in the basement's chamber ensured a permanent source of renewal for the binding. The manuscript described the selection criteria Blackwood had used when choosing victims. Children from desperate families were preferred because their disappearance would generate less official scrutiny. Orphans and recent immigrants were particularly suitable because they lacked extended family networks that might pursue independent investigations. The involvement of respected community leaders like my great-great-grandfather Thomas served multiple purposes. Their participation ensured protection from official inquiry, while their complicity bound them to maintain the secrecy necessary for the operation's continuation. The ritual itself had required the willing participation of adult accomplices who understood the supernatural dimensions of what they were facilitating. These individuals were not merely criminals seeking profit, but believers in Blackwood's promise of transcendence who hoped to eventually benefit from similar arrangements for themselves. The covenant that bound them together was both legal and spiritual, creating obligations that extended beyond death and applied to subsequent generations of their families. According to the manuscript, the portrait would serve as Blackwood's primary means of influence over the living world, allowing him to monitor and guide the families whose ancestors had participated in his activities. Should any generation attempt to break the covenant by destroying the portrait or exposing the historical truth, they would face consequences that began with misfortune and escalated to death. Ensuring the continued silence that protected all involved parties, the basement chamber contained evidence of the covenant's enforcement over the decades. Newspaper clippings documented the deaths and disasters that had befallen family members who had apparently attempted to break their inherited obligations. A cousin who had tried to sell the portrait in 1923 died in a house fire that destroyed his entire family. An uncle who had begun researching Blackwood's activities in the 1960s suffered a series of accidents that ultimately left him institutionalized and unable to communicate coherently. My grandmother's final months, I realized, had been spent in a desperate attempt to free her family from this inherited curse. Her increasing paranoia and isolation were symptoms of supernatural pressure that intensified as she moved closer to direct confrontation with Blackwood's influence. Her instruction to burn the portrait represented her final effort to break the covenant, but she had died before completing the task, leaving the burden of decision to the next generation. As I stood in that underground chamber, surrounded by evidence of crimes that had maintained their influence across nearly 2 centuries, I began to understand the true scope of what I had inherited. The portrait was not merely a painting, but a prison, containing the consciousness of a man who had murdered children to achieve immortality, and who continued to demand compliance from the families whose ancestors had enabled his atrocities. The voices of the children, audible throughout the house but strongest near the portrait, were not vengeful spirits, but prisoners crying out for release from a bondage that had lasted far longer than their natural lives should have endured. Their suffering continued to power Blackwood's existence, creating a cycle of spiritual exploitation that would persist until someone found the courage to break the covenant, regardless of the consequences. As standing in the darkness of that ritual chamber, I felt the weight of generational responsibility settling across my shoulders like a burial shroud. The portrait waited upstairs, patient and watchful, confident that self-preservation would ultimately triumph over moral obligation, as it had with every previous generation. The choice before me was not merely personal, but generational, affecting not only my own fate but the possibility of freedom for victims whose torment had lasted nearly 2 centuries. The covenant demanded continued silence and complicity, but the children's voices called for justice and release, creating a conflict that could only be resolved through action that would put everything at risk. My first attempt to destroy the portrait came 3 days after discovering the basement chamber. I had spent those intervening days researching methods that might prove effective against an object that existed simultaneously in physical and spiritual realms. Fire seemed the most promising approach, given my grandmother's final instructions and the symbolic associations between flame and purification found throughout occult literature. The portrait resisted destruction with a malevolence that transcended passive resistance. Matches refused to ignite when brought near the canvas. Lighters produced flame that immediately extinguished upon contact with the painted surface. Even when I managed to apply burning material directly to the frame, the fire spread only to the surrounding wall, leaving Blackwood's likeness completely unharmed. The house responded to these attempts with escalating violence. Windows shattered without apparent cause, sending glass fragments across rooms where no one stood. Doors slammed with force sufficient to crack their frames. The temperature variations that had previously served as mere annoyance became extremes that threatened physical harm. Rooms that reached freezing levels where breath formed ice crystals, alternating with heat that made extended presence impossible. Most disturbing was the portrait's active response to destruction attempts. Blackwood's painted expression shifted to display unmistakable rage, his eyes following my movements with hatred that felt personal and immediate. His hands, previously folded in patient repose, moved to positions that suggested grasping or choking motions. The papers on his desk rearranged themselves to form words and symbols that conveyed threats in multiple languages, including some that appeared to predate conventional alphabets entirely. Physical assault proved equally futile. Knives dulled instantly upon contact with the canvas. Hammers bounced off the surface as if striking hardened steel. When I attempted to remove the portrait from its hanging position, I discovered that it had somehow become permanently affixed to the wall, integrated with the house's structure in ways that made separation impossible without demolishing the entire building. Each failed destruction attempt brought immediate and severe consequences. After the fire attempt, I suffered burns on my hands that appeared without exposure to flame, developing into blisters that formed patterns matching the ritual symbols I had seen in the basement chamber. Following the physical attack, I experienced injuries that manifested as defensive wounds, as if I had been in a struggle with an opponent possessing superhuman strength and malevolent intelligence. The pattern of supernatural retaliation extended beyond physical harm to encompass every aspect of my life outside the house. My employer received anonymous complaints about my work performance that resulted in suspension pending investigation. My bank froze accounts due to allegations of fraudulent activity that proved baseless but required weeks to resolve. Utilities were disconnected without explanation, forcing me to navigate bureaucratic mazes to restore basic services. These systemic attacks demonstrated that Blackwood's influence extended far beyond the house itself, reaching into the modern world through networks of complicity that had apparently been maintained across generations. The same families who had benefited from his original activities continued to protect his interests, their descendants occupying positions in banks, government offices, and service industries that allowed them to create obstacles for anyone who threatened the covenant's stability. My grandmother's final months, I now understood, had followed an identical pattern. Her medical records, which I obtained through persistent inquiry, documented a series of ailments and accidents that began precisely when she started researching methods for destroying the portrait. Heart palpitations with no underlying cardiac disease, falls that resulted in fractures despite her previously excellent balance and coordination, memory difficulties that her doctors attributed to age but which had manifested suddenly rather than gradually. The local authorities, when contacted for assistance with what I described as vandalism and harassment, displayed the same coordinated evasion I had encountered at the Historical Society. Police officers took reports with professional courtesy, but never followed up on investigations. Detectives assigned to cases involving property damage or threatening behavior found reasons to transfer to other jurisdictions or retire early. The legal system, supposedly designed to protect citizens from exactly the kind of persecution I was experiencing, proved to be another instrument of the conspiracy that had protected Blackwood's interests for nearly 2 centuries. Most revealing was my contact with other potential victims of similar supernatural persecution. Through careful research and discreet inquiries, I located 3 other families whose histories suggested involvement with Blackwood's network. Each had maintained objects or properties that served functions similar to my inherited portrait, focal points for influences that demanded continued secrecy and compliance from successive generations. The Morrison family, descendants of the people whose 3 children had been among Blackwood's earliest victims, owned a music box that played melodies no one could identify, accompanied by sounds that resembled children's voices calling for help. Family members who attempted to dispose of the music box suffered accidents and misfortunes until they retrieved it and returned it to its designated place in their home. The Hartwell descendants possessed a set of china that had supposedly belonged to their 19th century ancestors, but which bore stains that could not be removed despite decades of cleaning attempts. The stains formed patterns that matched the ritual symbols from Blackwood's basement chamber, and family members reported that the china occasionally rearranged itself to spell out messages or warnings in languages none of them understood. Most disturbing was the account provided by Sarah Pemberton, a descendant of the Dr. Pemberton whose establishment had received children from Blackwood's operation. The Pemberton family had inherited a collection of medical instruments that could not be discarded or donated despite their obvious obsolescence. Family members who tried to remove the instruments from their designated storage area experienced nightmares featuring children who begged for help while being subjected to procedures that transcended medical treatment and entered the realm of ritualistic torture. Each family had learned to accommodate their inherited burden through generations of careful management and strategic silence. They had discovered that cooperation brought relative peace, while resistance inevitably resulted in escalating supernatural pressure that could destroy lives, careers, and even physical health. The conspiracy that protected these arrangements was not imposed by external authority, but maintained by the victims themselves, who had learned that survival required complicity in their own spiritual imprisonment. My attempts to coordinate resistance among these families met with universal rejection. They had watched previous generations suffer the consequences of defiance, and they possessed no confidence that collective action would prove more successful than individual resistance had been. Their ancestors' crimes had created a spiritual debt that apparently could not be discharged through conventional means, leaving them trapped in cycles of inherited guilt that bound them as effectively as any legal contract. The portrait's behavior during this period of expanded investigation became increasingly aggressive and personal. Blackwood's painted features began to display expressions I recognized from historical descriptions of his living personality. The cold intelligence that had enabled him to manipulate desperate families, the calculating cruelty that had selected children for sacrifice, the absolute confidence that had convinced respected citizens to participate in activities they would never have contemplated under ordinary circumstances. The children's voices, audible throughout the house but concentrated near the portrait, began to speak in more contemporary language, suggesting that their spiritual imprisonment had not isolated them from the modern world, but had forced them to witness nearly 2 centuries of continued suffering without the power to intervene or escape. They spoke of other children who had been drawn into Blackwood's influence through means that adapted to changing times while maintaining the same fundamental purposes. The revelation that Blackwood's activities had not ended with his physical death, but had continued through spiritual means that adapted to each generation's circumstances, transformed my understanding of what resistance might require. The portrait was not merely a historical artifact that preserved the memory of past crimes, but an active instrument through which those crimes continued to be committed against new victims, whose disappearances were concealed by the same networks of complicity that had protected the original operation. The choice before me was not simply whether to risk personal consequences for the sake of historical justice, but whether to accept responsibility for ongoing atrocities that my inherited complicity was helping to perpetuate. The covenant demanded not merely silence about past events, but active participation and their continuation, making every day of inaction another form of collaboration with forces that had claimed children's lives for nearly 200 years. As winter deepened and the supernatural pressure intensified, I began to understand that conventional destruction of the portrait would never be sufficient to break the spiritual bonds that connected Blackwood's consciousness to the physical world. The painting served as a focal point for his influence, but that influence was maintained by the continued complicity of families like mine, whose inherited guilt provided the spiritual energy necessary to sustain his posthumous existence. Breaking the covenant would require not the destruction of a single object, but the exposure of historical truth that multiple generations had died to protect, creating consequences that would extend far beyond my own family to encompass everyone whose ancestors had participated in Blackwood's network of exploitation and murder. The letter arrived without postmark or return address, slipped beneath my front door during the night by someone who had approached the house without triggering the motion sensors I had installed around the property. The envelope bore my name written in careful script that resembled the handwriting I had seen in Blackwood's ledger, though the paper was contemporary and the ink showed no signs of age. "You are not alone in your struggle," the message began. Others carry similar burdens. Others have made similar discoveries. The network that protected Blackwood's activities extends beyond what you have uncovered, and breaking free requires coordination that has never been achieved by individual effort. The letter provided addresses for 7 families scattered across New England, each identified by surnames that appeared in Blackwood's records as participants in his arrangements. The writer explained that these families had maintained contact across generations, sharing information about supernatural manifestations and coordinating responses to crises that threatened exposure of their shared history. "We meet twice yearly," the letter continued, "on dates that correspond to the completion of Blackwood's most significant rituals. The next gathering will occur on December 23rd, the anniversary of his final covenant ceremony. Your attendance would be welcomed, but your safety cannot be guaranteed should you choose to participate." The letter was signed with a symbol that matched one of the ritual markings from the basement chamber, suggesting that its author possessed knowledge of Blackwood's occult practices that exceeded what could be gained from casual historical research. The invitation represented either an opportunity for coordinated resistance or a trap designed to bring together all remaining threats to the conspiracy in a single location where they could be eliminated simultaneously. My research into the listed families revealed a pattern of inherited trauma that extended far beyond what I had previously understood. Each bloodline showed evidence of mysterious deaths, unexplained accidents, and psychological disorders that manifested in family members who attempted to investigate their ancestral connections to Blackwood's activities. The supernatural persecution I had experienced was apparently a standardized response that had been refined across generations to ensure continued compliance from reluctant participants. The Morrison family had lost 3 members to house fires over the past century, each incident occurring shortly after the victim had begun researching the family's 19th century history. The Hartwell descendants showed a pattern of premature deaths from illnesses that medical professionals could not definitively diagnose or treat effectively. In every case, the symptoms had begun when family members attempted to dispose of inherited objects or relocate away from properties that had been in the family since Blackwood's era. Most revealing was the documentation maintained by these families regarding their supernatural experiences. Unlike my own recent discoveries, they had been recording manifestations, threats, and apparitions for decades, creating archives that demonstrated the systematic nature of the spiritual imprisonment they had inherited. Their records showed that Blackwood's influence operated according to predictable patterns, intensifying during specific dates that corresponded to his original ritual calendar and responding to perceived threats with escalating levels of supernatural violence. The families had learned to navigate this inherited curse through strategies that balanced acknowledgement of their obligations with minimal active participation in ongoing criminal activities. They maintained the objects and properties that served as focal points for Blackwood's influence while avoiding actions that might strengthen his power or expand his reach into contemporary society. It was, they had discovered, a delicate equilibrium that provided relative safety at the cost of perpetual spiritual bondage. Several families had attempted to break free through methods that I had not yet considered. The Pemberton descendants had consulted religious authorities, seeking exorcisms and spiritual interventions that might sever the supernatural connections binding them to Blackwood's influence. These efforts had universally failed, often with catastrophic consequences for the clergy members who attempted to provide assistance. Father Mackenzie, a Catholic priest who had tried to perform an exorcism on the Pemberton medical instruments in 1987, had suffered a complete psychological breakdown that left him institutionalized for the remainder of his life. Reverend Williams, a Methodist minister who had blessed the Morrison Music Box in 1995, had died in a car accident that investigators attributed to mechanical failure, but which family members recognized as supernatural retaliation for his intervention. The pattern suggested that Blackwood's spiritual power had been enhanced by the ritualistic sacrifice of children to levels that exceeded the authority of conventional religious practice. His consciousness existed in a realm that was technically beyond the reach of traditional Christian spiritual warfare, protected by binding rituals that drew upon traditions that predated and transcended established religious frameworks. Other families had attempted escape through geographic relocation, hoping that distance from inherited properties and objects might weaken the supernatural connections that maintained their bondage. These efforts had also failed, often spectacularly. Family members who attempted permanent relocation found themselves experiencing escalating supernatural persecution that intensified with distance from their ancestral obligations, creating pressure that forced their eventual return to compliance. The Hartwell family's attempt to relocate to California in 1962 had resulted in a series of accidents and misfortunes that systematically destroyed their new life until they returned to New England and resumed care of their inherited china collection. The Morrison family's effort to establish themselves in Florida during the 1970s had ended when their youngest child began experiencing nightmares and behavioral changes that medical professionals could not treat effectively. Improvements occurring only after the family retrieved their music box from storage and restored it to its traditional position in their home. These documented failures suggested that the spiritual bonds created by Blackwood's rituals could not be broken through avoidance or distance, but required direct confrontation with the source of his power. The portrait, the basement chamber, and the accumulated guilt of nearly 2 centuries of complicity had created a supernatural fortress that could apparently withstand any individual challenge to its authority. The letter's invitation to a coordinated meeting represented the first opportunity for collective action that any of the families had encountered. Previous generations had remained isolated, each struggling with their inherited burdens without knowledge of similar struggles occurring in parallel bloodlines. The systematic maintenance of this isolation had prevented exactly the kind of coordinated resistance that might have proven effective against Blackwood's continued influence. As December 23rd approached, the supernatural activity in my grandmother's house intensified to levels that made normal residence nearly impossible. The portrait's behavior became increasingly violent, with Blackwood's painted features displaying expressions of rage and anticipation that suggested awareness of the planned gathering and its potential threat to his continued dominance over the participating families. The children's voices grew stronger and more insistent, speaking not only of their own suffering, but of other victims whose spiritual imprisonment they had witnessed across the decades. They described a realm of consciousness that existed parallel to the physical world, populated by the souls of children who had been sacrificed to maintain Blackwood's posthumous power and influence. These revelations suggested that the stakes of the December 23rd meeting extended far beyond the liberation of a few New England families from inherited supernatural persecution. Blackwood's continued existence was apparently sustained by an ongoing harvest of spiritual energy that was drawn from both historical victims and contemporary sources, creating a cycle of exploitation that would continue until someone found the courage and knowledge necessary to break the fundamental binding that maintained his power. The choice before me was whether to attend a gathering that might represent either the first real opportunity for collective liberation or a trap designed to eliminate all remaining threats to Blackwood's dominance. The portrait watched these preparations with malevolent satisfaction, as if confident that fear and self-preservation would ultimately triumph over moral obligation, as they had with every previous generation. The children's voices provided the only guidance available, urging action despite the risks, reminding me that their nearly 2 centuries of suffering deserved acknowledgement and justice, regardless of the personal cost that liberation might require. The meeting took place in an abandoned church outside Hartford, Connecticut, a Gothic revival structure that had been deconsecrated in the 1970s following a scandal that had never been fully explained to the public. 7 families answered the invitation, bringing with them the accumulated knowledge and inherited burdens that had defined their bloodlines for nearly 2 centuries. We gathered in the nave as winter wind howled through broken windows, each family positioned around objects that served as focal points for their supernatural imprisonment. The Morrison music box played its haunting melodies throughout our discussions, accompanied by children's voices that seemed to emanate from the instrument itself. The Pemberton medical instruments gleamed with unnatural light that illuminated ritual symbols carved into their metal surfaces. The Hartwell china displayed stains that shifted and rearranged themselves to form messages in languages none of us could read, but all of us somehow understood. My grandmother's portrait, which I had transported with great difficulty and considerable supernatural resistance, occupied a position of prominence near the church's altar. Blackwood's painted features displayed expressions that cycled through rage, amusement, and malevolent confidence, as if he were attending our gathering as an interested observer rather than the target of our intended rebellion. The families shared stories that revealed the full scope of Blackwood's continuing influence over contemporary society. Children still disappeared, though modern techniques made the vanishings less obvious and more easily explained through conventional causes. Runaways became permanent missing persons. Foster children were transferred to facilities that existed only on paper. Immigrant families were told their children had been placed with relatives who could not be located when questions arose about their welfare. The network that had originally protected Blackwood's activities had evolved and expanded, adapting to changing times while maintaining the same fundamental purposes. Banks, social services, law enforcement agencies, and medical institutions contained descendants of the original participants, their inherited obligations ensuring continued cooperation in activities they might not fully understand but dared not investigate too deeply. Dr. Helena Morrison, a descendant of the family whose 3 children had been among Blackwood's earliest victims, had spent decades researching the supernatural mechanisms that maintained his posthumous influence. Her investigations had revealed that consciousness could indeed be bound to physical objects through rituals that combined extreme suffering with specific astronomical and calendrical conditions, creating spiritual anchors that persisted long after physical death. "The binding requires periodic renewal," she explained, her voice barely audible above the wind that seemed to carry children's whispers through the ruined church. "Every generation must provide new spiritual energy to maintain the connection between Blackwood's consciousness and our physical realm. Our compliance provides some of that energy, but it's not sufficient by itself. He needs fresh suffering, new victims, contemporary sources of the terror and despair that originally powered his transformation." The revelation that our inherited guilt served not as punishment for ancestral crimes but as fuel for ongoing atrocities transformed our understanding of what liberation might require. We were not merely victims of supernatural persecution but unwilling participants in a system that continued to claim children's lives nearly 2 centuries after Blackwood's physical death. The Pemberton family's research had identified the specific conditions necessary to break the spiritual binding that maintained Blackwood's influence. The ritual required voluntary sacrifice from representatives of all the bloodlines that had participated in his original network, performed during astronomical conditions that matched those present during his final ceremony in December 1847. Voluntary sacrifice, Dr. Pemberton clarified, does not necessarily mean death, though death remains a possibility. It means accepting full responsibility for our ancestors' crimes and their consequences, including the likelihood of supernatural retaliation that could destroy everything we value about our contemporary lives. The choice before us was stark and unforgiving. We could return to our homes and resume the careful management of inherited curses that had characterized our family's relationship with Blackwood's legacy for generations. We could continue to accommodate evil while hoping that our compliance would protect us from the worst consequences of our ancestral guilt. Or we could accept responsibility for crimes we had not committed but had inherited, acknowledging that liberation required sacrifice that might extend beyond personal consequences to encompass everything and everyone we cared about in the contemporary world. The families voted one by one, each decision carrying weight that extended far beyond individual preference to encompass the fate of victims whose suffering had lasted nearly 2 centuries. Some chose safety and continued complicity. Others chose resistance despite the certainty of supernatural retaliation. When my turn came, I looked at the portrait that had dominated my grandmother's hallway and felt the weight of generations pressing against my shoulders like a burial shroud. Blackwood's painted eyes met mine with confidence that suggested he had witnessed this scene before, had seen previous generations face identical choices and ultimately choose self-preservation over moral obligation. But the children's voices, audible throughout the ruined church but strongest near the artifacts that maintained their imprisonment, spoke of suffering that had lasted far longer than their natural lives should have endured. They deserved acknowledgement and justice regardless of the personal cost that liberation might require. I chose resistance, not because I possessed unusual courage or moral superiority, but because the alternative meant accepting responsibility for atrocities that would continue as long as fear maintained the silence that protected their perpetrators. The ritual that followed was not dramatic or violent, despite the supernatural forces it challenged. We simply told the truth, documenting everything we had discovered about Blackwood's activities and our family's complicity in language that could not be misunderstood or rationalized away. We photographed the artifacts, recorded the manifestations, and prepared detailed accounts that would be distributed to media organizations, law enforcement agencies, and historical societies across New England. The truth would survive even if we did not, ensuring that future generations could not claim ignorance of their inherited obligations or the consequences of continued silence. As dawn broke over the abandoned church, the supernatural manifestations that had defined our family's lives for generations began to fade. The children's voices grew fainter, but their tone shifted from desperation to something approaching peace, as if acknowledgement of their suffering had begun the process of liberation they had awaited for nearly 2 centuries. The portrait's behavior changed as well. Blackwood's painted features still displayed malevolence, but the confidence that had characterized his expression throughout our gathering had been replaced by something that might have been uncertainty or fear. The spiritual power that had sustained his posthumous existence was beginning to weaken as the silence and complicity that had protected him finally gave way to exposure and accountability. We returned to our homes knowing that supernatural retaliation would follow our rebellion, but also knowing that we had broken the cycle of inherited guilt that had bound our families to Blackwood's influence for nearly 2 centuries. The truth would spread despite attempts to suppress it, creating consequences that would ultimately free not just our bloodlines but all those who had suffered under similar spiritual imprisonment. The portrait continues to hang in my grandmother's hallway, but its power over my life has been fundamentally altered by acknowledgement of the crimes it represents and acceptance of responsibility for their consequences. Blackwood still watches, but he watches over his own slow dissolution as light finally penetrates the darkness that has hidden these atrocities for over a century. The children's voices have grown silent, not because they have been forgotten, but because they have finally been heard. Their suffering has been acknowledged, their stories preserved, their deaths given meaning beyond the spiritual energy they provided to sustain their murderer's posthumous existence. Truth, once spoken, cannot be unspoken. Justice, once demanded, cannot be indefinitely denied. The portrait that was meant to ensure eternal silence has become instead a permanent reminder that some evils are too profound to be hidden, and that courage, however late in coming, can still serve the cause of liberation for those who have waited nearly 2 centuries for someone to choose moral obligation over self-preservation. The choice echoes still, through darkened hallways where portraits watch with diminishing power, in the silence where children's voices once cried for help, and in the understanding that inherited guilt can finally be transformed into inherited responsibility for ensuring that such atrocities never occur again.